All right, we're going to look at chapter 26, and we're going to be reviewing Rococo to Neoclassicism and the Enlightenment that occurs in intellect in between Rococo and Neoclassicism, and how that's going to affect things. So we're also moving into the time of the Industrial Revolution, so we're slowly encroaching on the 1900s, and our time frame for this, real quick, is 1700. Our time frame for this is 1700 to 1800. Okay, and the Industrial Revolution is going to occur and begin in England, and then it's going to find its way over to the Americas and into the rest of Europe. So the art during this time is going to transform quite dramatically from a very soft romantic look in the Rococo, that's Rococo, to a new approach to classical art, which is going to be pulled and derived from the Renaissance, called Classicism. So neo means new, and classicism is obviously a reference to classical art. And whenever we're referring to classical art at this time, we're referring to the Renaissance, now that we have come past the Renaissance. And then in the Renaissance, it's a rebirth of antiquity and the classical art that was found in Greek and Roman times with the advent of Renaissance. And what's going to happen here at the beginning, and even right throughout the Neoclassicism, is women are going to be considered a key factor in the overall narrative. With the Rococo, the interest of woman being the subject is to help embrace the idea of softness and femininity in the work. And then, so they become a very heavy epicenter to the narratives of the work, of those paintings. And then also the architecture and such. Then, as we get into the Enlightenment and into Neoclassicism, they're still present, and they're present to counter the logic and the reason that's coming out of the Enlightenment with the importance of emotionalism. So during the Enlightenment, it was very much addressed with Newton, with Rousseau, with Voltaire, with Locke and Hobbes. And these individuals were very much about the idea of reasonalism and rationality of the mind through intelligence and through science and study of sciences and such. But they also believe that it's important to have the femininity quality of emotionalism as well, and kind of finding a way to balance out the two. So the femininity and also rationality. So having both. That's according to the Enlightenist. That's not according to me. That's according to the Enlightenist. And I think personally that can be found in any individual, femininity in a male and masculinity in a female whenever it's necessary, whenever it's required to really pave forward and get something done, or to really address it in a very heartfelt way, whatever it might be. It doesn't matter what your sex is or gender or whatnot. So, but this is a time, almost 300 years ago that we're talking about, where this element of enlightenment is coming forth. So let's begin with Rococo. And Rococo is going to be a new, softer style, and it's going to be loved by the French artist. And it's going to be loved by the French artists and the aristocrats in France, starting in Paris after Louis XIV dies. And we talked about Louis XIV, that's the sun god in France, and we talked about Versailles in the last chapter. And so his son, Louis XV, is going to take over and embrace this element of Rococo. And it's going to be a new, softer style. It's not going to have hard edges. It's not going to be luminous, or not luminous. It's not going to be lustrous, like with heavy uses of gold and such. It's going to be much softer colors, like pastels and silver versus gold. and platinum versus gold. So much softer metals are going to be used. And also during this time in France, it begins in France and then makes its way to England, makes its way to Germany, but begins in France, in Paris, is that these aristocrats are more interested in moving out into the country, into townhouses, and not big elaborate palaces or facilities like that, that Louis XIV had in Versailles. They're moving out to smaller establishments, still very wealthy and more aristocratic, but much more low key in regards to Versailles, and definitely more nature based and less urban based. They did this because by moving out to nature, it reinforces that Rococo, that new softer style, by being in a soft environment, by being in a natural or a nature-based environment. And they feel like by moving out to the country, into these townhouses, it's going to create an expression of lighthearted elegance. And we can see that start to develop in the architecture with figure 26.3 by Cuvier's Hall of Mirrors in the Nymphenburg Palace Park. And this one is in Germany. So they all started in Paris, France, and then they ended up making their way into Germany and up into England. Okay. Now what's happening here is it's a hall of mirrors, and I'm going to discuss why this hall of mirrors is more Rococo and different than the Baroque, French Baroque that we saw with Versailles, with the hall of mirrors that Louis XIV had built on the entryway into Versailles. So again, this is the Nymphenburg Palace. Okay, so it's still considered a townhouse, but it is larger in scale, more like a palace. It has a circular hall of mirrors instead of a rectilinear. So the whole idea of these hard, sharp edges are being softened by using this circular hall instead of this rectilinear hall. So that's what's making it more Rococo versus Baroque. Also within this hall of mirrors is the use of silver, stucco, and crystals. So by using this combination of stucco, silver, and crystals, especially the silver and the crystals, is that the light that emits from the silver and reflects off of the silver softens the mood in the space. So again, Rococo is to soften the mood, to give a sense of expression of lightheartedness, but still staying elegant. So those are their main adjectives: elegance, lightheartedness, and softer. Okay? So by using the silver light and by using the silver surfaces throughout this hall of mirrors, it gives it that softer appearance. And the blue that you see, that bluish green, is more of a pastel. It's more of a softer blue, almost to the verge of being a turquoise-like green, which is something that was more Rococo and less Baroque. Baroque was still very vibrant and bold in color, and Rococo is softening the color usage. Okay, so again, with the silver light, it will soften the mood and also will reflect soft contours throughout the space. And it will make it seem more organic and as if it's growing in motion. So you look at all that floral arrangement up above the mirrors, growing up onto the ceiling, it has this sense of this soft level of natural existence that are beyond the walls and that are outside of the palace, making its way inside as well. So it's kind of coupling. So it still has that Baroque element of taking something outside and bringing it in and making it more spacious looking, but this is more of the natural, nature, organic elements that are found outside of the palace and making their way in. So this Rococo is more organic, and it fixes more on the growing in something in motion, instead of something suddenly stopping and ceasing to move. Okay, so let's look at a painting. I'm hoping that we can get this whole chapter in one video. That's the plan. We're going to look at a painting, and the painting that we're going to refer to is figure 26.9 by Fragonard, The Swing. Okay, oil on canvas, The Swing, 26.9. And we're going to see how this is Rococo in relation to the Hall of Mirrors that we just looked at, which is a piece of architecture. So again, soft. And it's soft based off of the nature. There's no hard lines in the trees. There's no hard lines in the Cupid sculpture to the middle left. It's all very softly rounded edges. The foliage is soft. The branches are soft. The bark is soft. The overall fabric, the flowers, everything is soft and lighthearted. Okay, the playfulness of being on a swing, kicking the shoe off into the air, her counterpart laying in the bushes, in the flowers, admiring her, swinging, is a very soft and lighthearted level of elegance. So it's all designed in a way to feel that softness and that lightheartedness. And of course, you have the organic aspect, that is the environment itself growing, and how that's reflected in those soft pastels of pink and blue and green within the clothing of the lady on the swing. And also her partner in the flowers down to the bottom left. All right. So it's a very playful scene. And Fragonard is known as a decorative and a colorist. And now remember, we talked about Titian being a colorist. And Titian was a colorist coming from Venice at a time when all these pigments were available, and he was using bold, bright, vibrant colors. And he was able to shift that. But what Fragonard is doing, he's doing a similar thing with the hues of color, but he's shifting them to lighter tones instead of bolder tones, like we saw with the mannerism of Titian as a colorist. Here, Fragonard as a colorist is shifting the hues of color to a soft palette, very soft and pastel-like. So he's shifting the tones in one color back and forth between light and lighter. Instead of dark to light, he's going light to lighter. So he's staying on the light end of the spectrum instead of jumping over to the dark, the darker hues, which is something we were seeing in the Baroque period, especially with Caravaggio and all of his followers. And by doing that, it creates a level of sensuality. A playfulness, a very subtle innuendo of sensuality by the use of these soft colors. Okay, this playfulness, but more of a romantic connection between figures instead of an aggressive connection between figures. No one's being like captured or kidnapped or anything like that, like we've seen with abduction sculptures and paintings in the past. Here, it's a very soft, sensual connection between two. And that is what makes Rococo romantic, is that it is this very loving and playful and almost childlike teenage crush kind of feeling that the figures have within the artwork. Okay, so again, the sensuality of the soft pastels and of the activity and playfulness gives it that sense of lightheartedness. All right, so that sensuality comes from a level of lightheartedness instead of aggressiveness. All right. Then what's going to happen is the Enlightenment is going to shake things up. Okay, the Enlightenment's going to happen. So let me just break down what's going to happen with the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is going to give rise to revolutions that will relax this Rococo style. I would go into depth about what the Enlightenment is, but just know that it is discoveries in like major sciences, like physics and chemistry, and focuses on morality and ethics and philosophies and a whole bunch of ideas that break away from the old Renaissance concepts. And they're brand new, consciously forward and cognitively forward thinking intellectual ideas in philosophy and in ethics and in sciences. Main names that you're going to see are going to be Voltaire, Rousseau. I'll talk about Rousseau here in a second. Newton, right? Isaac Newton, and John Locke, and all kinds of individuals that are focusing on reason and the pursuit of reason and the mind becomes more important than the body. Okay? So that's what the Enlightenment is all about. And it's beginning really in France, and then it's making its way throughout the rest of Europe. But through these new waves of thinking and thought, it's setting up revolutions within these countries and making them question their leadership kingdoms, and that they, as enlightened individuals, should be able to govern their own country and not rely on this system of feudalism or this kingdom. So all of these kingdoms are breaking down through this, from this Enlightenment, creating revolutions, and then democratically the countries are developing post-Enlightenment thought. But on a visual level, it is going to break down this romantic, soft, Rococo style, because this was considered elitist. This was considered part of the aristocratic party. The Enlighteners, the Enlightenment followers, are not part of this aristocratic group, and they want to break down this, what it seems to be an illusion of reality, and they want to prove realistically what reality is through reason and through truth, and that comes philosophy. So that's going to set up a new wave of art called natural art, and then also Neoclassicism. That's what the Enlightenment's going to do. So that's how we're shifting out of Rococo. And the first main philosopher for the natural art is Rousseau, Roussseau. And Rousseau believed that emotions were more important than reason. And this is one of the reasons I mentioned that woman is center to a lot of this artwork that we're seeing during the 19th century, or 1700 to 1800. Okay, or 18th century, 1700 to 1799. So he believes in emotionalism, in that it is emotionalism that determines things from the heart before our mind can reasonably react. So he's in that belief. So with that came a series of art called natural art, Natural art. And one in particular, a painter that I want to refer to that is derivative, or that is embracing Rousseau's ideas, is Brun, figure 26.15, and it's her self-portrait, Brun. And with the self-portrait, what it's doing is it's reflecting that emotionalism first, and with that comes personalism. Whenever you present yourself in a controlled, emotionalistic way, almost like ordered in chaos, it comes off as the most personal way of exposing yourself as possible. And the artwork at this time is reflecting Rousseau's written documents on the importance of allowing essentially the heart to bleed. And the artwork will reflect that personalization of who you are through emotionalism. So that's what this painting is all about. It's about reflecting emotionalism coming from the studies of Rousseau. So it's all about the emotion first, and with that, what is ultimately going to happen in sequence is it's going to create less pretentious portraiture. Less pretentious portraiture. Now, the portraiture we saw with Rembrandt was fun and active, and it really wasn't that pretentious. But a lot of the portraiture that's being developed for like the kings and the royals and such, like King Louis of France, the King Philip of Spain, and all these other, the Pope in Rome, all these other high aristocratic individuals, the portraitures are very pretentious. And now with this advent of questioning and including morality and emotionalism into your artwork, it becomes less pretentious. And it's seen here with Brun herself painting. And it is setting up a series of gazes. She's looking at you. She's taking the time to pause and to look at you as a viewer, give you a smile, recognize that you're there, and be proud that you're there observing what she's doing. So that makes it more personable. As if you could be a complete, I don't know if you've ever met somebody, you just walk up to them, you start talking with them, and they act like they've known you for 50 years. They've known you your whole life. They're just so open and they're so warm, and you just want to tell them everything. That's what this natural art is supposed to do. It's supposed to make you feel warm and coupled to this level of softness and personalization. And also what that does technically by making it emotional through the natural art is it doesn't make it look contrived. It doesn't make it look like it's forced, but it shows a natural self-confidence coming out of Le Brun herself. So it allows the true individual and who she is to be present in this one painting. Just this one painting. All right. And then now we're going to talk about another natural painter, but we're going to shift gears just a little bit because this is going to be a painter in America, actually. One of the very first American painters that was famously recognized in Europe, and it's Benjamin West. And this is Death of General Wolfe. Okay? And how he's going to portray the naturalism is, again, the use of the emotionalism. But he's going to couple it with morality and patriotism, which is going to be a big part of the neoclassical art. So West is the bridge from this Rococo to this naturalism with natural art that we saw, and then now into neoclassicism. West is considered a natural artist, but his work is moving and shifting an interest towards neoclassicism. And let me explain through Death of General Wolfe. Again, figure 26.20. He clothed the individuals in the painting in contemporary attire and costume. All right? And the reason he did this was to arrange them in a complex and theatrical order. And why he did that in this theatrical arrangement is so that it made it look as if General Wolfe died like a saint. So essentially what I'm saying is you could take any of the past paintings and you could, let's say, Lamentation of Christ or Lamentation of any saint, and you would put those biblical characters into this painting. You took all of these clothes, all these realistic elements of who these people are, and then you superimposed them with biblical figures, disciples, followers, Mary, Joseph, Mary Magdalene, Jesus himself, and it would look like this. But he's taking that concept that was a classical concept, but he's applying present day contemporary situations in 1771. All right? By putting on the clothing of the individual and staging it in a way where it looks like the event just happened, but still reflecting back on a sense of martyrdom, a sense of his death being appreciated by the state instead of, like with Jesus, his death being appreciated by God. So he's kind of running the two in parallel. There's a subtle religiosity behind this painting, all right, which is going to be a wave into neoclassicism. So let me read a little bit more about it. So he arranged them in a complex theatrical order, which is like a Baroque technique, right? The subtle religiosity theme of the way in which they're arranged is a Renaissance connection. The emotionalism that's involved in them is very that natural artism coupled with realism. But the only big difference is that the martyrdom of General Wolfe is not for God directly here, but it is for England. But still, his death cladded in this clothing that he wouldn't typically wear on the battlefield, first of all. This is stuff that he would wear whenever he was at a banquet. But he was clothed in this costume, in this attire, to show his connection and his allegiance and patriotism and moral decision making on patriotism for England. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, real quick, we're going to talk about Neoclassicism. We're going to look at one artist by the last name of David. And we're going to refer to painting 26.25, Oath of the Horatti. Now, what happens and where Neoclassicism comes from is that it's a rebirth of Renaissance in the Enlightenment. So as we're going through the Enlightenment in this 100 years, there's an interest in going back and rediscovering the classics from the Renaissance. And that's why we call it Neoclassicism. Now, how that happened is because individuals during this time, artists, were being allowed to go to Italy and to view archived work that Raphael, Leonardo, Michelangelo all did. The painters in particular. Michelangelo's were always exposed. You could always see them because they were mostly sculptures and architecture, except for the Sistine Chapel, which was in architecture, and you could see it. So they were able to go and learn from what was made a couple hundred years back. And with that became this interest in revitalizing classicism, hence Neoclassicism. All right. And then also another thing happened in an excavation of Pompeii in Italy from Mount Vesuvius, the uncovering of Pompeii. And with the uncovering of Pompeii, artists were allowed to go in and investigate and see what old Roman Empire artwork looked like, which was covered up by this volcanic eruption during the height of the Roman period, around 200 BC up until about 120 CE. So that was uncovered. So the artists were going to Italy to look at these old paintings from the Renaissance, and they were able to go and look at the discoveries in the excavations of Pompeii. So with that, it just recatalyzed and revitalized the interest in classicism. And this is why Neoclassicism has come to be. Now, how does David do that, and how does that fit into the Enlightenment? So the Oath of the Horatti is an emphasis on an ideologist of those French revolutions that were going on at this time. So remember, the Enlightenment brought up these revolutions, and they were causing revolts against the French kingdom. And this painting is supposed to signify the importance of that patriotism behind the revolutions after the Enlightenment to push the kingdoms down and to bring ultimately democracy to the forefront. He also used the Renaissance models as reference. So the bodies, the stress, the tensed kind of larger, muscular, like bodily features in the males is something that he's bringing back with the Renaissance. He called Rococo artificial taste, which is what we saw, and he called the classical the perfect form. So essentially saying Rococo is artificial, it's only artificial in allusion to the aristocrats, which the Enlightenment is proving doesn't need to be running the show anymore. So now we need to go back to a time, the classical period, where things were perfect, and install that element of artistry in the present day revolutionary period, and have that in France as our flag to follow forward, not Rococo or Baroque, because that was very true to the elitist. We're moving away from the elitist and we're moving into the everyday person. And this artwork needs to reflect that element that's coming from the classical period. So the Enlightenment, it's really based off of the Enlightenment because it has to deal with something about morality. And this painting is about that morality. And David believed that, and so do the Enlightenment philosophers, that if you have something that shows a past element of morality and value, that will help activate present day morality and virtue. So that's why he was painting in this way, because he saw that in classicism there were lots of stories of morality and reason and truth, and he wanted to recaptivate that for the present time in 1784. So that's why he tapped into the classical painting as well, because it already had a moral theme which was synonymous with the present Enlightenment that was happening in Europe. And what this story is it's a story of either to win or to die for Rome. And what this is the three sons, which are to the left, are swearing upon their three swords as their father holds it, that they will do anything that they can for the patriotism of Rome. And this is a pre-Rome Republic time. So this is a story from long, long ago. So it's a story of morality and patriotism, which was part of the Enlightenment. So that's why he pulled that story into this painting. That's why he depicted it. So they swear upon their swords on their father as their father holds them. Okay? Another thing that's Renaissance and classical about this is that emotions are low, though they are present in the women. It's very low in the women. They're not like tearing their hair out or like super crying. They're still somewhat equiposed. And then also what makes it Renaissance is that it's staged in this architectural environment. You can see the arcade behind them with a series of Doric columns, which again is representing that Greco-Roman period, that classical period. Also, the figures in here are staged like a Greco-Roman relief carving. They're all in the foreground, like they would be carved on relief that you would find on the Parthenon or on any temple that might have been done in Greece. Okay? And there's a contrasting element that's very classical, and that is the angles in the sons and also with the father with the swords to the left is contrasted by the curvaceous bodily movements of the women that seem sad on the right, which is creating a formula like the classical artists Raphael and Leonardo did. The men are patriotic and moral, and the women are emotional, which are both two ideas of the Enlightenment. So when we look at David's Oath of the Horati, you should be able to register what makes it part of the Enlightenment. And the last thing I mentioned is the men are very patriotic and moral. They're moral to their father, patriotic to Rome, and then the women have this level of emotionalism that the enlightened folks during this time in the 18th century believe were both equally important. To have the heart and to have the mind together, side by side. Okay? So that concludes chapter 26, and we'll get into chapter 27 real soon.